To New Hampshire now, where nearly all of the 2020 Democratic candidates are trying to rally support ahead of the nation's first primary 4 months from now. It's an especially crucial state for Senators Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren. Both are progressives from neighboring states.
Polling shows a close race there between those two candidates and former Vice President Joe Biden. For more on this, let's bring in CBSN political reporter Caitlin Huey-Burns. She is there in Manchester, New Hampshire. So, Caitlin, start by explaining to our audience, frankly, why this state is so significant when it comes to presidential races. I think if people remember back to their civics classes, they'll understand a little bit. But why don't you give us a little refresher?
That's right. We're here in New Hampshire, which is the first state to actually hold a voting contest, an actual primary. We talk a lot about Iowa, but that's the first caucus state. New Hampshire is the first in the nation primary state, and they take that responsibility very seriously. This is a tradition that goes back 100 years. So all of these Democratic candidates, about 19 of them, are going to come to New Hampshire this weekend for the annual state party convention. They'll have about 7 minutes each to speak on stage to several thousand activists and voters and people that they're trying to persuade to their case. You mentioned Senators Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders. Those are two candidates we're going to be watching here. Of course, Sanders from Vermont, Elizabeth Warren from Massachusetts. They have proximity to New Hampshire and are kind of really focusing their campaigns here. And former Vice President Joe Biden is also here campaigning around the state today. He is leading in those polls, but knows that he does have some competition. So that's kind of why we're here. New Hampshire is a really small state, so it allows a lot of these candidates to focus on retail politics, actually meeting voters one-on-one. You've seen, pictures and videos from those kind of iconic town halls here. And that's why a lot of these candidates like to focus on New Hampshire.
So we also saw a lot of the candidates in Iowa at the state fair. I want you to sort of compare how they pitched themselves in Iowa versus how they will be pitching themselves in New Hampshire.
Right, two very different states, although neither of these states are very diverse. Iowa is a lot bigger, a lot more rural, and New Hampshire is a place that you can get pretty much everywhere within about an hour or so. So lots of underdog candidates actually like to come here and campaign in New Hampshire because they feel like they're able to get everywhere pretty easily. They're able to meet a lot of voters and kind of cultivate grassroots support. So New Hampshire is also kind of known for some spoilers. It doesn't always pick the eventual nominee, even though Donald Trump won his primary here in 2016. Bernie Sanders won the Democratic primary in 2016 as well, overwhelmingly beating Hillary Clinton. We know Clinton eventually clinched the nomination. Pat Buchanan, of course, beat Bob Dole here in 1996, and Hillary Clinton in 2008 beat Barack Obama here as well. So doesn't always pick the winners, but this year we're really wondering kind of how voters here in New Hampshire are going to choose between kind of the head and the heart. Do they coalesce around someone that they believe is the most electable, or do they rally around the candidate that's most inspiring to them?
Caitlin, I wonder, this town hall that CNN had on the environment, on green issues, on climate change, I wonder if that's resonating with voters in this first state, New Hampshire.
Yeah, I would say that that's a huge issue. Climate change is a huge issue here in New Hampshire, especially because, lots of people come here to go skiing. It's very heavily dependent on the climate really matters a lot. Also, a lot of farms here as well. The other big issue here that we're going to hear candidates talk about is the issue of the opioid crisis. Democratic candidates have been unleashing plans to combat this crisis. I can say spent a lot of time here in 2016 following the Republicans, and that was a huge issue that they talked about in their primary. Of course, Donald Trump talked about it a lot when he campaigned here as well, and still does. So that's something we're going to be checking in with voters as well to see if they've seen any progress on that issue.
So, we talked about how important the state is for Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren. Bernie Sanders, I think, won the state by like 60% during the last election, but, it was a two-person race at that point. And now one of the things that we've discussed a lot throughout this whole sort of campaign time is that Bernie Sanders doesn't look so lefty anymore compared to everyone else. Everyone's sort of adopted a lot of his policies and points of view. So what does that mean for sort of more moderate centrist candidates in this state? Do they even have a chance?
Well, what's interesting about New Hampshire is about 40% of the electorate are undeclared voters, so they can participate in the primary process. Since there isn't a competitive Republican primary here, you might see a lot of independent voters participate in the Democratic primary, so that could have an effect. Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders have been here a lot. Elizabeth Warren has made the most trips out of all the candidates. Bernie Sanders has been second in that regard. Now, they're both close, so it's easy for them to campaign here. They campaign here a little bit differently. Bernie Sanders trying to, build up his base of support that he had here in 2016. Elizabeth Warren focusing more on that retail campaigning, going to lots of house parties, trying to meet voters one-on-one. Of course, she's famous for those selfie lines. She talks a lot about her personal story here and tries to kind of personally connect with voters. So we'll see kind of whether these voters are assessing Bernie Sanders differently than they were in 2016, given that there are more options here. I should also note that the economy here in New Hampshire is pretty good. So this will be a challenge for some of the Democratic candidates to talk about the economy in a way that doesn't seem like they're cheering on any kind of economic downturn. They'll probably talk a lot about wages and an economy that doesn't quite work for everyone has kind of been their message here in New Hampshire.
All right, Caitlin Huey-Burns for us there in New Hampshire. We appreciate it, Caitlin.